She walked into that ballroom like a storm wrapped in silk. No one knew her name. No one imagined that just months ago, she was cleaning the same floors she now walked upon. But when the doors opened, and every head turned, the world stopped. The billionaire who once ignored her couldn't take his eyes off her now, because in that moment, beneath the lights and whispers, the maid they had all overlooked was about to reveal a secret, powerful enough to change everything. This is the story of The Maid and the CEO, a story about power, redemption, and a love no one saw coming. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, from which city are you watching this video? We love seeing how far our stories travel. And don't forget, at the end, give the story your rating from 0 to 10. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy The Maid and the CEO.
The marble floors of the Whitford Plaza Hotel gleamed like mirrors, reflecting the golden morning light. By 6 a.m., Lizzie Carter had already changed 3 trash bags, polished brass rails, and adjusted every velvet armchair in the lobby. She moved quietly with precision, a shadow in the background of other people's comfort. To most guests she didn't exist. But to Graham Whitford, the man whose name crowned the hotel, she was about to become a target. The CEO stepped out of the elevator, tall, immaculate, wrapped in authority. His voice carried across the lobby as he spoke into his phone about the anniversary gala. Press, investors, the board, make it flawless. When he hung up, his gaze fell on Lizzie. Not with curiosity, with calculation. Carter, right? His tone cut the air. Yes, sir. Thursday night. The gala. You'll attend. The words landed with the weight of a command, not an invitation. Lizzie blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Sir, that's all. He turned away before she could answer, his stride as sharp as his suit. The smirk that ghosted across his face wasn't kindness. It was a test. He wanted to see her out of place, to remind her where she stood. Downstairs, in the service corridor where the scent of bleach replaced perfume, Lizzie leaned against a locker and closed her eyes. Her reflection stared back from the metal door, tired, smudged, unremarkable. Or so the world believed. Inside that same locker, tucked between folded cleaning cloths, was an envelope she hadn't opened in years. She hesitated, then pulled it out. A photo slid free, her, in a navy dress, receiving a Rising Leader Award in Boston. That was before everything collapsed. Before her business partner vanished with the funds. Before her name became a whisper. Before she became the help in someone else's empire. She exhaled slowly. If he wanted her humiliated in that ballroom, he'd get something else entirely. The next morning, she walked 2 blocks to a small tailor shop owned by Mrs. Elena Marchetti, a quiet Italian woman who'd seen every kind of story pass through her fitting room. I need something elegant, Lizzie said softly. Simple, black, and silent. Elena measured without a word, her eyes kind but knowing. You'll turn heads, she murmured. I don't need to, Lizzie replied. I just need to stand tall. By Thursday afternoon, she'd studied the guest list that was left unattended in the event office, memorizing faces, titles, and leverage. Every name on it represented a step back toward who she used to be. Or maybe who she was meant to become. When the clock struck 8 p.m., the chandeliers above the ballroom shimmered like 1,000 watchful eyes. Lizzie stood before the glass doors of the hotel, no longer a shadow but a storm dressed in elegance. Inside, Graham Whitford waited, unaware that the woman he'd invited to break would be the one who'd shake his world instead. A thin drizzle gave New York a cold, metallic glow that night. Under the bright awning of the Whitford Plaza Hotel, black cars lined up as guests stepped out wrapped in luxury, designer gowns, sharp suits, and the scent of expensive perfume. It was the annual Whitford Gala, the night when alliances were sealed, fortunes were decided, and reputations were either made or destroyed. Lizzie stopped before the glass doors. The reflection staring back at her no longer belonged to the hotel made everyone ignored. The black dress, perfectly tailored by Mrs. Marchetti, fit her like quiet confidence. Her hair was pinned with precision, her posture upright, her eyes calm, the kind of calm that doesn't ask for a place, it simply takes it. As she entered the ballroom, eyes turned toward her, some curious, others judging. She didn't flinch. She moved with a steady grace, listening more than she spoke, absorbing every detail. An investor complaining about contracts overseas, a philanthropist avoiding her rival's gaze, 2 board members whispering about upcoming layoffs. This was where real power flowed, between champagne glasses and fake smiles. Then she saw him. Graham Whitford stood at the center of the room, immaculate in a deep navy suit, posture strong, gaze alert. When he noticed her, there was no surprise, only analysis. His eyes traced her slowly, deliberately. Then he raised his glass, offering a silent, mocking toast. Half respect, half challenge. Lizzie responded with a subtle nod. No fear. No submission. Only presence. The orchestra played softly. Laughter floated through the air, shallow and rehearsed. She moved to the bar, took a glass and waited, until she felt him standing behind her. His voice came low, firm and too close. "Champagne, Miss Carter. I don't usually drink while I'm working, Mr. Whitford." "Interesting. I thought you were here as a guest." She turned slowly, meeting his gaze head-on. "I am. But I never stop working. It's how you survive." He smiled faintly, that kind of smile that both provokes and threatens. "Survival isn't enough to belong in this room." "I agree," she said steady. "But it's enough to learn who actually deserves to stay in it." His expression hardened, but for the first time there was something else behind it. Respect. A flicker of curiosity. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Let's be clear, Carter. No one here will treat you as an equal." She tilted her head slightly, unwavering. "Let's be clear, Mr. Whitford. I didn't come here to ask permission." For a moment the world went silent. The music, the laughter, the clinking glasses, all faded. There was only his gaze. And hers. Quiet duel. He was the first to break the silence. Straightening his jacket, he murmured, "Let's see how far you can go, Carter." Then he turned and walked away, leaving behind a mix of challenge and intrigue. But as Lizzie watched him disappear into the crowd, she already knew. This was only the beginning of the game. And this time she wasn't a pawn. She was the one moving the board. The morning after the gala, the Whitford Plaza felt different. The corridors still smelled of expensive perfume and champagne, but the air carried a new tension. Whispers, glances, and the same question on everyone's lips. Who was that woman in black? It wasn't the speech of the CEO that people remembered, nor the investors' toasts. It was the maid who had walked among them like she belonged there. Lizzie swept the 10th floor hallway, listening as 2 receptionists whispered near the elevator. "Some say she was a special guest." "Special?" The other laughed. "That's Carter from housekeeping." But I swear Mr. Whitford looked at her like he was trying to solve a riddle. Lizzie didn't react. Her face remained calm, her hands steady on the broom. But deep inside, a quiet satisfaction stirred. Later that morning, she crossed the lobby carrying a tray of fresh flowers. Graham Whitford was there, alone, sitting on a leather sofa, reading something on his tablet. He looked up when she passed. No words. Just a long, assessing stare that unsettled her far more than she wanted to admit. "Good morning, Mr. Whitford," she said, steady. He closed his tablet and studied her a little longer. His tone unreadable. "After last night, I thought you'd at least call me Graham." There was the faintest flicker of amusement in his voice. She managed a polite smile. "I assumed you preferred formality." "It depends on the person," he replied, and the silence that followed was charged. Not hostile, not yet soft. Just something in between. When he finally stood, the distance between them felt narrower. His voice dropped slightly. "Who are you, Carter?" "Someone who does her job," she said. "That's not what I saw last night. I only went to the event you asked me to attend." He studied her for a moment longer, then said, almost to himself, and ended up stealing the room's attention. That wasn't intentional. The real kind of power never is. Something in his tone made her pause. It wasn't arrogance this time, it was recognition. For the first time, she glimpsed the man behind the control. The one who rarely let anyone close enough to see him flinch. He turned away before she could reply, his composure snapping back into place. "Get back to work, Carter," he said, walking off. But even as he left, she could feel it, the shift. Something had changed between them. And for the first time, she wasn't the only one being watched. The next few days unfolded with an unfamiliar quiet inside the Whitford Plaza. Graham avoided crossing her path, yet somehow she kept finding traces of his attention everywhere. Her name mentioned in passing by supervisors, new supplies suddenly available for her shift, a subtle rearrangement of schedules that kept her near the executive wing. Lizzie noticed. She always noticed. But she said nothing. When she cleaned the corridor outside his office, the faint sound of his voice reached her through the door. Calm, sharp, precise. The language of leadership. Yet beneath that tone she heard fatigue. A kind of loneliness that didn't belong to the powerful, but to the guarded. He was a man constantly surrounded, yet completely alone. At night, when the hotel emptied and silence took over the hallways, she caught herself replaying fragments of their exchanges. The look in his eyes when she spoke back to him. The brief pause before his sarcasm returned. There was something human buried deep beneath the layers of control, something she couldn't define but couldn't ignore. And somewhere in that same silence, Graham found himself thinking of her too. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself it was professional interest, the puzzle of a woman who refused to behave as expected. But it wasn't. It was the echo of something he hadn't felt in years, a presence that lingered even when she wasn't in the room. By the fourth day, he called his assistant and requested Carter's file. No reason given. He scanned it quickly. Education, previous employers, a short gap of missing years. Nothing alarming, yet something didn't add up. Her posture, her vocabulary, the way she navigated the world. It didn't match her resume. For the first time in years, Graham Whitford couldn't categorize someone. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. Rain fell softly over the city as Graham stepped out of the car and crossed the lobby of the Whitford Plaza. It was late, close to midnight. The lights were dim, the bar closed, the hallways silent. Then he heard something, faint, delicate, almost out of place. Someone was playing the piano in the empty ballroom. The melody was gentle and melancholic, and he recognized it. Claire de Lune. Debussy. He pushed the door open and saw Lizzie sitting at the black grand piano, her hands gliding over the keys with precise, graceful movement. There was no audience, no reason for her to be there. Just her and the music. The same woman who spent her days scrubbing marble floors was now playing like someone who understood silence in its purest form. Graham stood motionless, watching from a distance. For a moment, she looked like someone else. Someone from a past filled with light, maybe happiness. When the final note faded, she startled at the sight of him. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "The piano wasn't locked. I just wanted to hear the sound." He lifted a hand, stopping her. No need to explain. She lowered her gaze, uncomfortable. But Graham didn't look away. Her posture, her voice, her control, none of it matched her job title. There was something about her that didn't belong to that world. Something that intrigued him. The next morning in his office, he reopened her file. This time slowly. An old address caught his eye. An upper-class neighborhood far beyond the means of a hotel maid. There were also notes about foreign language courses, piano lessons, and volunteer work at an art foundation. Tiny fragments, almost invisible. But together they began to form another picture. He leaned back in his chair, unsettled. She was hiding something. And it wasn't something small. That afternoon, he watched her from across the lobby as she replaced vases and polished the glass doors. Every movement calm, precise. She worked like someone who had already known chaos, and had chosen peace instead. During a board meeting later that day, Graham realized he wasn't listening to a single word being said. The image of her sitting at the piano kept returning again and again. He didn't understand why, only that it wouldn't leave. And maybe, for the first time in years, Graham Whitford wondered if he still knew who he really was, or if everything he'd built had been nothing but armor to cover the emptiness. That night, when the hotel was silent again, Lizzie returned to the ballroom. But the piano was closed. On top of it, a folded note on company stationery read, "Don't stop playing. GW." She stared at it quietly, and smiled. Without knowing exactly why, the days that followed felt longer. Lizzie kept her focus on work, yet something unseen lingered in the air. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. Ever since the note about the piano, she could feel his presence even when he wasn't around. The sound of firm footsteps in the hallway, the door of his office opening, the quiet that filled the spaces between meetings. Everything seemed charged with a quiet tension. That week, the hotel was hosting an international investors conference. The pace was relentless. Lizzie took on double shifts, silent, efficient, always in the right place at the right time. And Graham watched from afar. He no longer saw a maid. He saw someone who understood the invisible balance of things, the rhythm between what is shown and what is kept hidden. One afternoon, as she crossed the lobby, a small commotion drew her attention. A fallen flower, a broken vase, a stain spreading across the carpet. One of the assistants had tripped, scattering a tray of glasses. Without hesitation, Lizzie knelt to gather the shards carefully. Graham came down the stairs at that very moment. His eyes found hers amid the mess. No words, but he stopped, and for the first time he knelt beside her. "Careful," he said quietly. She looked up startled, not by his words but by his tone. The commanding voice, once distant and cold, now sounded human. For a brief instant, the powerful CEO was just a man, helping her pick up the broken pieces. When they finished, silence hung between them. Lizzie stood, straightened her uniform, and thanked him. Graham only nodded. But the look he gave her was different. Not superiority, recognition. That night, rain whispered against the city. From his office above, Graham watched her on the security feed as she finished her shift alone. It was nearly midnight. She folded the last cloth, turned off the lights, and stood for a moment looking toward the piano in the corner. Then she walked to it, brushed her hand gently over the closed lid, and smiled faintly, a quiet, knowing smile. Graham switched off the screen and caught his own reflection in the glass. For reasons he couldn't explain, that woman, simple, quiet, resilient, was slowly breaking through the defenses he had spent a lifetime building. And he knew, the more he tried to stay away, the closer she would get. The next morning, the Whitford Plaza woke to chaos. The main ballroom was being prepared for a high-profile investors' press conference. Cameras, reporters, and security teams filled the space. It was the kind of day when perfection was mandatory, and mistakes were unforgivable. Lizzie was working quietly, clearing glasses and straightening tables before the event began. Everything seemed under control, until a sudden accident disrupted the calm. One of the waiters, rushing past, stumbled, spilling hot coffee all over the table that held the documents of a major international investor. In seconds, the room turned tense. "This is unacceptable," shouted the investor's aide, as journalists began filming the commotion. Lizzie rushed to help, grabbing a cloth, saving some papers, cleaning before the stains could spread. But in the middle of the chaos, someone shoved her aside. "Stay out of this. You people caused it," the man barked. She lost her balance, the tray clattering to the floor. The sharp sound filled the entire room, and every camera turned toward her. Then Graham appeared. He crossed the floor in long, deliberate strides. His eyes, the same ones that could silence an entire boardroom, now burned with quiet anger. Without a word, he stepped between Lizzie and the man who had pushed her. The room fell silent. "The incident has been handled," Graham said firmly, his voice echoing. "And the responsibility is mine." The aide began to protest, but Graham cut him off with a calm, commanding gesture. The Whitford name takes ownership of its own mistakes. Lizzie stood frozen, staring at him. It was hard to believe. The man who once tested and provoked her was now defending her in front of everyone. Afterward, the press conference continued as if nothing had happened. He was composed, sharp, in control. But those who truly watched, and Lizzie did, could see it, the tension in his shoulders, the distance in his gaze. When the event ended, he found her in a side hallway. She tried to thank him, but he spoke first. "It was nothing," he said, looking away. But his voice betrayed him. "I know," she replied softly. "But it was the first time you lost control, for someone else." He met her eyes then, no sarcasm, no mask. Just truth. Then he turned and walked away, leaving behind the weight of something neither of them could hide anymore. That night, Lizzie returned to the ballroom. She sat at the piano and began to play. When the last note faded, the quiet sound of soft applause broke the silence behind her. He turned. Graham stood at the door, silent, composed, but with a look that held something entirely new, something tender. Neither of them spoke. But they both knew something had changed, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, something changed, quietly but irreversibly. No one mentioned what had happened at the press conference, yet everyone knew. The CEO's look before the cameras, the impulsive act of defending her, the silence that followed. It was enough to be remembered by all who saw it. Lizzie, however, tried to return to routine, to clean, to organize, to move on. But something in her eyes had shifted, a faint light that betrayed the feeling of finally being seen by someone who looked beyond appearances. Graham, on the other hand, fought against what he felt. He locked himself in his office for hours, convincing himself it was only curiosity, perhaps gratitude, nothing more. Yet every night, when the hallways emptied and the city quieted, he found himself watching the security cameras. Her silhouette moving across the lobby, her hand turning off the lights, and it left him restless. That Friday, a storm swept over the city. The hotel was nearly empty. Lizzie was finishing her shift when the manager announced that employee transport had been suspended due to the weather. She would have to stay until morning. Hours later, while the wind howled outside, she walked to the main hall to fetch a forgotten blanket. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from flashes of lightning cutting across the sky. Then she heard footsteps behind her. It was Graham. "The hotel's closed," he said quietly, almost hesitant. "I thought no one was left here." She smiled faintly, holding the blanket in her arms. "I live too far to risk going home." "You did the right thing," he replied. "It's bad out there." For a few seconds they just stood there, the rain filling the silence between them. Graham took a step closer. The lightning revealed his face, strong but weary. She could see how tired he looked, how heavy the quiet was on him. The kind of exhaustion that success never cures. "Sometimes I wonder," he said finally, "when everything became so distant." "From what?" she asked softly. "From myself." The honesty caught him off guard. She didn't reply, only met his eyes. Not with pity but with understanding. The kind of gaze that undoes even the strongest armor. Outside, the storm grew louder. And without a word, Lizzie opened the piano again. Claire de Lune. Graham stood still for a while, listening. Then he walked closer and sat beside her. No words, just silence and music. When the final note faded, the quiet that followed carried everything they didn't dare say. She stood slowly, ready to leave. But as she passed him, his hand brushed hers, a brief, unplanned touch, heavy with meaning. Neither spoke. But both knew. The line between them no longer existed. The morning after the storm, the hotel woke in calm. The air was heavy with humidity, and the scent of rain drifted through the glass doors of the Whitford Plaza. Lizzie walked through the quiet hallways, gathering towels and tidying the lobby, but her mind was elsewhere. The night before replayed in her thoughts like a fragile dream, The piano, his voice, the touch of his hand. Something had changed without warning. Something impossible to name, yet impossible to ignore. Graham arrived early as always. Composed, distant. But something in him was different too. His eyes. There was hesitation now, a silence between words, as if he needed time to navigate feelings he had never allowed himself to have. Throughout the day, their paths crossed a few times. No words. Only the quiet that carried the weight of what had happened between them. The kind of quiet that turns ordinary moments into something dangerous. In the afternoon, Lizzie was called to the top floor. A last-minute meeting to prepare the main hall for an upcoming investor's visit. When she entered, she found only Graham, standing before the glass wall, staring at the city below. He didn't turn around. His voice came low and steady. The event yesterday. It was more than I expected. She froze, uncertain if he meant professionally or personally. Then he turned slowly, and their eyes met. "Lizzie," he said, using her name for the first time. "I shouldn't have gotten involved." She drew a breath. "You didn't get involved, Mr. Whitford. You just defended me." "It was more than that," he murmured. Outside, the rain began again, tracing soft lines down the glass. The reflection made it seem as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. Lizzie looked away, her pulse quickening. She knew one wrong word could shatter whatever fragile balance remained. Then suddenly the door opened. Clara, the event manager, stopped at the threshold. The silence in the room told her everything she needed to know. "Sorry to interrupt," she said curtly. "There are reporters downstairs. They're asking for a statement about yesterday's incident." Graham's expression hardened. "Tell them I'll speak in 10 minutes, he replied, his voice returning to its usual control. When Clara left, the silence returned, thicker than before. Lizzie took a small step back. "I don't want to be a problem for you," she said softly. "You're not a problem, Lizzie," he answered, his tone low but firm. "You're the opposite of that." For a moment, time seemed suspended. His gaze held something he could no longer hide. But before that tension could turn into something else, the phone on his desk rang, sharp, breaking the spell. While he answered, Lizzie slipped away without a word. That night, Graham returned to the piano room. The same folded note still rested on the lid, slightly crumpled, faded from the humidity. He picked it up and read it again in silence. "Don't stop playing." But this time he realized. He was the one who needed to hear those words. That night the hotel slept, but Lizzie didn't. The distant sound of guards' footsteps echoed through the halls while she sat alone in the empty ballroom, staring at the reflection of lights on the closed piano lid. It was there, in that silence, that her past began to breathe again. It had all started 3 years earlier. She once had a respected name, a promising career, and a dream, to create a system that would make the hotel experience more human, more personal. She worked sleepless nights, sacrificed birthdays, friendships, and any trace of a normal life. All in partnership with a man who claimed to love her, an ambitious entrepreneur named Victor Hale. He was charming, intelligent, and cruel in ways she only understood too late. When the project was finally finished, Victor registered everything under his own name. The ideas, the prototypes, the presentations, all of it. And when she tried to defend herself, it was already too late. He had rewritten the story. The media believed him. The investors believed him. And Lizzie became the villain of a story she hadn't written. The resentful employee who tried to steal the work of a visionary genius. No one wanted to hear the truth. She lost everything. Her job, her reputation, her home. The invitations stopped coming. The doors closed. Her name, once a key to open opportunities, became a weight she could no longer bear. So she ran from her own life. She changed cities, looks, and routines. When she first entered that hotel, asking for any job available, the manager looked at her resume and asked why someone with a university degree would want to clean floors. Lizzie simply answered, "Because sometimes starting over is the only way to stay alive." And that's how it began. No glamour, no ambition, just the quiet hope of being invisible. But destiny, in its irony, placed her under the roof of the most demanding, guarded man she'd ever met. Graham Cole, the CEO whose eyes could silence a room. At first she despised him. His arrogance, his tone, the way he made her feel invisible, everything reminded her of Victor. But slowly she noticed something different. There was loneliness in his gaze. A hardness that came not from cruelty, but from fear. And that realization kept her there when pride told her to leave. Now, as the clock ticked past midnight, Lizzie closed her eyes and remembered the email she'd received earlier that day. An anonymous message from a journalist claiming to have proof that Victor had stolen her patent and that the case was about to be reopened. Her heart raced. Years of silence were about to collapse. For the first time, the truth might finally be heard. But what she wanted most wasn't justice. It was peace. From the glass balcony above, Graham watched her quietly. He saw the woman sitting before the piano, calm, fragile, yet filled with stories he didn't know. And for the first time he felt the need to understand who she truly was. The next morning, the hotel felt quieter than ever. The hallways, once filled with hurried voices, were empty. Lizzie was cleaning the main lobby when she heard that unmistakable voice behind her. "We need to talk," Graham said. She turned slowly. His eyes were different now. No arrogance, no impatience. There was something else there, guilt, or maybe respect. "Can we talk in my office?" he asked. Lizzie hesitated. The memories were still too fresh. But something inside her whispered that running away was no longer an option. She followed him in silence. The office was bathed in soft morning light. Graham walked to his desk, placed a few papers on it, and took a deep breath before speaking. "I found out who you are." Lizzie froze. Her gaze fell upon the folders, old newspaper clippings, the printed email, proof of everything she'd tried to bury. "I didn't mean to investigate your life," he continued. "But your name appeared in an internal report. Got curious. I looked deeper, and I found the truth." Lizzie lowered her head, unable to deny it. "So now you know," she whispered. "That I was deceived. That I lost everything. That I became this because no one believed me." Graham stepped closer. "I read the articles and the testimonies," he said quietly. "Even your post on that innovation forum 3 years ago." She looked at him, surprised. "You read that?" "I did," he said. "And for the first time, I realized I had judged someone without knowing their story." Silence filled the room. Lizzie's chest tightened. She had expected judgment, not understanding. But his voice carried something else. A quiet confession. "I know what it's like to be underestimated," he said. "I inherited this hotel from my father, but no one ever truly accepted me. The board saw me as the spoiled kid who got lucky. So I learned to be cold, hard, intimidating just to be respected." He raised his eyes to hers. "Maybe that's why I humiliated you that day. Because for a moment, I saw in you the freedom I'd lost." Lizzie blinked, stunned. "Freedom," she repeated softly. "Yes," he said. "Even in that uniform, you seemed more real than anyone else in that ballroom. And I didn't know how to handle it." For a long moment they stood facing each other, speechless. The truth, raw and unguarded, lingered between them. Neither was who the world thought they were. Lizzie took a deep breath and, for the first time, spoke without fear. "I never hated you, Graham. I just hated myself. For letting fear decide who I'd become." He took one step closer. "Then don't be afraid now." Their eyes met and something shifted. The air felt lighter. Time slowed. It was as if, in that moment, they saw each other for who they truly were. Two wounded souls learning to begin again. Without a word, Graham gestured toward the piano in the corner. "Play something." Lizzie hesitated, then approached the instrument. The first notes filled the room. Simple, fragile, full of feeling. Graham stood watching, and each note seemed to dissolve a piece of the armor he'd built. When she finished, he whispered, "You shouldn't be cleaning floors. You should be inspiring people." She smiled softly, eyes glistening. Maybe I just needed someone to believe again. He stepped closer. He didn't speak. But his eyes, the same ones that once made her retreat, now spoke everything his voice couldn't. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. And for the first time in years, Lizzie felt the future breathe again. The days that followed were different. There was something new in the air, a calmness the hotel had never known. The staff could feel it. Graham was less severe, almost gentle. And Lizzie, though she tried to hide behind her routine, couldn't disguise the light that had returned to her eyes. That week, Victor's case hit the headlines. The evidence sent by the journalist confirmed everything. Fraud, intellectual property theft, falsified documents. Lizzie's name was back in the news, but this time as the woman who had been wronged and endured in silence. Graham followed everything closely but kept his distance. He knew she needed to face that chapter on her own. And when a reporter called asking for an interview, Lizzie refused. "I don't want fame," she said softly. "I just want peace." Still, she knew something inside her was unfinished. That's when, one rainy night, Graham appeared quietly in the laundry room where she worked. He wasn't wearing a suit. No posture of power. Just him, simple, human. "Tomorrow the hotel is hosting a gala," he said calmly. "I want you to come." Lizzie frowned. "Me?" "Yes. Not as an employee. As a guest." She hesitated. "I don't know if I should." "You deserve it," he replied. "And maybe it's time the world sees who you really are." The next night the ballroom was full. Golden lights shimmered across the walls, and the sound of a piano drifted softly among the guests. Then the doors opened, and a murmur spread through the room. Lizzie entered. A flowing black dress traced her figure with quiet elegance. No jewelry, no heavy makeup. Just her authentic, radiant, with the same calm eyes that once looked up from a cleaning cart. But now something was different, confidence. Graham waited near the stage. When their eyes met, time seemed to stop. She walked toward him, and the entire room fell silent. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because you taught me that strength isn't control," he replied. "And that no one is small when they believe in themselves." Graham reached out his hand. "Play for them." She sat at the piano, and the first notes filled the room, the same simple melody she had once played in his office. But now it sounded different. It was hope. It was rebirth. And as the crowd listened, Graham's gaze never left her. When the song ended, the ballroom erupted in applause. Lizzie stood, overwhelmed, and looked at Graham. He stepped onto the stage, approached her slowly, and without a word took her hand. The gesture was simple, yet it carried everything. Forgiveness, new beginnings, and a love born where no one expected it. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now," he said, smiling. "We start for real." The lights dimmed, the music began again, and they danced right there, surrounded by memories, by everything they had overcome. Outside, the rain had stopped, as if the world itself was finally breathing with them. The next morning, Lizzie would return to being who she truly was. Creator, dreamer, a woman whole again. But this time she wouldn't be alone.
And that's how their story began. Not with perfection, but with forgiveness, courage, and love reborn from pain. What did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments below. Tell us, what score would you give it from 0 to 10? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to follow our next stories. There are more emotional tales waiting for you on the final screen. Thank you for watching until the end.